Curtis and Winter sentencing.
Okay, Curtis and Winter, your trial starts in an hour. It's time to go to court.
All right. Let's get this over with.
At the courthouse.
All rise for the Honorable Judge Alfred Smith.
You may all be seated. All right. Court is now in session. Curtis and Winter Wilson, you two have been charged for the same sort of crimes as Gracie was. Prosecutor Henry Maverick, read the charges.
Curtis and Winter Wilson, you two have been charged for child abuse, child neglect, child abandonment, and illegal conspiracy.
How do you two plead?
Well, Your Honor, I plead not guilty. Winter and I didn't conspire with anyone.
I agree with my husband. Not guilty. And adding on to what he said, our son's been acting racist to Black and Asian people and homophobic to members of the LGBTQ community.
While I agree with your reasoning behind your son's past actions, there was evidence that was contrary to your statement. So, I call upon my first witness, Keegan Decker.
While I understand Tripp acted racist towards my son Rocco, his girlfriend Veronica, and my daughter Rachel, Curtis and Winter couldn't see the big picture behind Tripp's actions. Before Tripp met my two kids at high school, he got bullied by Sage, Vincent, Michael Dale, Dustin Halifax, and Luke Rivera all because his family was poor. And since Rocco got dragged into that mass assault against Tripp and Alexa in the day the latter two of which got expelled and arrested, Curtis and Winter didn't care about his pain. They just disowned him and disregarded all the injuries he sustained from all the times he got assaulted by the Sage crew and their former principal. Therefore, I say Curtis and Winter are guilty.
Thank you, Keegan. I call upon my next witness, Rebecca Decker.
I agree with Keegan. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child neglect.
Thank you, Rebecca. I call upon my next witness, Rocco Decker.
Look, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. I totally get how racist your son was towards me, my sister, and my girlfriend. But you didn't teach him the right lesson. You neglected him when he got assaulted, even the day you disowned him after when he and Alexine we got expelled and arrested for assaulting Ackah. You didn't take him to the hospital, you didn't treat his injuries, nothing. And for that, I say you're guilty.
Thank you, Rocco. I call upon my next witness, Rachel Decker.
I agree with my older brother. I find Tripp's parents guilty of child neglect and child abandonment.
Thank you, Rachel. I call upon my next witness, Guy Coleman.
I totally get that Tripp acted racist towards my daughter Veronica and the Decker siblings, and as a black man myself, I'm deeply offended by that. But Curtis and Winter didn't take into consideration how scrambled their son's mental health was. Prior to high school, he got bullied by Sage, Vincent, Michael Dale, Dustin Halifax, and Luke Rivera, all because he dreamed of becoming a wrestler even though his family was poor. Tripp's parents have also been neglecting his injuries since the beginning of the mass assaults against him and most of his friends, including his girlfriend Alexine. And they kept on neglecting Tripp up to the day he and Alexine got expelled and arrested for assaulting Ackah, which was the day they disowned him. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Guy. I call upon my next witness, Mavis Coleman.
I agree with Guy. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child neglect and child abandonment.
Thank you, Mavis. I call upon my next witness, Veronica Coleman.
Look, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. I know your son acted racist towards me, my boyfriend Rocco, and his sister Rachel, but you've been neglecting him, especially when he got assaulted. You never gave him a chance to apologize to any of us. You just kept abusing him up to the day you disowned him when he and Alexine got expelled and arrested for assaulting Ackah. So for that, I say you're both guilty.
Thank you, Veronica. I call upon my next witness, Roderick Umbra.
I understand Tripp acted homophobic towards my son Aaron all because he was gay, and I'm not happy about it, but Curtis and Winter never understood why Tripp was like that. Tripp himself got bullied prior to high school all because his family was poor and that he dreamed of becoming a wrestler in spite of that. And despite Tripp's experience as a victim of bullying, His parents didn't care, they just neglected him even when he got assaulted by the Sage crew and their former principal. And the last straw that broke the camel's back was when Curtis and Winter disowned Tripp the day he and Alexine got expelled and arrested for assaulting Aiku. Therefore, I say Tripp's parents are guilty.
Thank you, Roderick. I call upon my next witness, Jeanette Umbra.
I agree with Roderick. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child neglect and child abandonment.
Thank you, Jeanette. I call upon my next witness, Ann Umbra.
Look, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. I know Tripp acted homophobic towards me and my boyfriend Reginald all because we're gay, but that doesn't mean you should neglect and disown him. You never gave him a chance to apologize for that. Instead, you've been abusing him for years. Even if he got bullied by Sage, Vincent, Michael Dale, Dustin Halifax, and Luke Rivera prior to high school. So for that, I say you're guilty.
Thank you, Ann. I call upon my next witness, Andrew Knight.
Look, Curtis and Winter, I understand Tripp acted homophobic towards my son Reginald all because he's gay and I'm not happy about it either. But that doesn't mean you should abuse your own son or even disown him. Remember, he got bullied by Sage, Vincent, Michael Dale, Dustin Halifax, and Luke Rivera before high school. You could have set him up with a therapist, but instead, you chose to leave him behind and neglect him. Even when he got assaulted multiple times back at Springfield. And the worst thing is, you don't seem to care. So for everything you've done, I say you're both guilty.
Thank you, Andrew. I call upon my next witness, Layla Knight.
I agree with Andrew. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child neglect and child abandonment.
Thank you, Layla. I call upon my next witness, Reginald Knight.
Tripp may have disrespected me and my boyfriend Ann all because we were gay, but what he did to us wasn't even serious enough for his parents to abuse him. They didn't even give him a chance to apologize to us. Instead, they treated him like a worthless hunk of junk and threw him away the day he and Alexine got expelled and arrested. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Reginald. I call upon my next witness, Jack Luna.
Tripp and Deacon may have messed with my daughter Storm all because she was a lesbian and I'm not happy about that, but Curtis and Winter treated their own son very badly. They assaulted Tripp a few times, neglected his injuries, and when he got expelled and arrested for assaulting Aiku, they disowned him, their own son. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Jack. I call upon my next witness, Jupiter Luna.
I agree with Jack. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Jupiter. I call upon my next witness, Storm Luna.
Sure, Tripp disrespected me all because I'm a lesbian, but he was bullied by Sage, Vincent, Michael Dale, Dustin Halifax, and Luke Rivera, and he was abused by his own parents. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson assaulted Tripp a few times, neglected his injuries, and disowned him. And what's worse, they didn't care how badly he got treated. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Storm. I call upon my next witness, August Webb.
I understand Tripp disrespected my daughter Emery all because she was a lesbian and I'm not happy about that either, but that doesn't mean Curtis and Winter should abuse him. They didn't raise him properly. Instead of taking him to a therapist, they abused him, neglected him, and disowned him. Therefore, I say they are guilty.
Thank you, August. I call upon my next witness, Hazel Webb.
I agree with August. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Hazel. I call upon my next witness, Emery Webb.
Tripp may have disrespected me and my girlfriend Storm all because we're lesbians, but his parents didn't discipline him correctly. They abused him, neglected him, and disowned him. They never treated his injuries or took him to a therapist or a hospital. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Emery. I call upon my next witness, Carter Forrest.
Curtis and Winter, I know Tripp acted homophobic towards my son Danny all because he was bisexual. Believe me, Leonora and I were disappointed in him too. But you can't abuse him over that. You treated him very badly and disregarded the fact he was bullied over his dreams of becoming a wrestler in spite of you being poor. And the worst thing is, you don't seem to care. You could have set Tripp up with a therapist. But instead you assaulted him, neglected him, and disowned him. For that, I say you're both guilty.
Thank you, Carter. I call upon my next witness, Lenore Forrest.
I agree with Carter. Curtis and Winter, I find you two guilty of child neglect and child abandonment.
Thank you, Lenora. I call upon my next witness, Danny Forrest.
Tripp may have disrespected me and my girlfriend Hope all because we're bisexual, but it wasn't as serious as the way his parents treated him. All they did was abuse, neglect, and disown him. They never treated his injuries from all the times he got assaulted, and they never took him to a therapist. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Danny. I call upon my next witness, Atlas Ellis.
It's true that Tripp acted homophobic towards my daughter Hope all because she was bisexual, but his parents didn't take the right approach on dealing with that problem. Instead of giving him a chance to apologize, they abused him, neglected him, and disowned him while disregarding the fact that he was bullied prior to high school. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Atlas. I call upon my next witness, Morales.
I agree with Atlas. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Maya. I call upon my next witness, Hope Ellis.
I know Tripp acted homophobic towards me and my boyfriend Danny all because we're bisexual, but his parents abused him, neglected him, and disowned him. None of the stuff they did taught him a lesson for disrespecting either of us. All it did was let him succumb to his injuries, especially from all the times he got assaulted. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Hope. I call upon my next witness, Tanaka.
You know Curtis and Winter, I get why you disowned your own son. I was upset when he and Alexine assaulted my son Akio. But what they did wasn't serious enough for you to do that. And from what Akio and Sakura told me and their mother, your son was bullied by my old partner's 2 sons and 3 of their friends prior to high school. Sure, Charles and Lily were upset about Sage and Vincent bullying Tripp, but they didn't disown them. They gave them the chance to reconcile with him, which is something you never had him do with everyone he did wrong. All you did was assault him, neglect him, and disown him. So for never giving Tripp a chance to turn over a new leaf and make amends with my son, which he did on his own accord, I say you two are guilty.
Thank you, Ryo. I call upon my next witness, Tanaka.
I agree with Ryo. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Chiyo. I call upon my next witness, Aiku Tanaka.
Look, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, I get that Tripp and Alexine assaulted me out of racism, but you two didn't give him the proper help he needed. Especially because he got bullied by Sage, Vincent, Michael Dale, Dustin Halifax, and Luke Rivera prior to high school. You assaulted him a few times, neglected all of his injuries, even the ones from the 2 mass assaults against him, and disowned him without giving him a chance to redeem himself. So for all the stuff you did to him, I say you're both guilty.
Thank you, Aiku. I call upon my next witness, Sarah Tanaka.
I agree with Akio. I find Tripp's parents guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Sarah. I call upon my next witness, Ren Tanaka.
I'm on the same page as Akio and Sora. I say Tripp's parents are guilty.
Thank you, Ren. I call upon my next witness, Sakura Tanaka.
Gotta agree with my older brothers and sister on this one. I find Tripp's parents guilty as charged.
Thank you, Sakura. I call upon my next witness, Kenji Tanaka.
I also find Tripp's parents guilty. Racism is bad, but so is child abuse. No matter what form it comes in.
Thank you, Kenji. I call upon my next witness, Hiroshi Tanaka.
I'm with Kenji. Sure, Tripp and Alexine assaulted our older brother Akio and our entire family's upset about it. But Mr. and Mrs. Wilson are no better because of the way they treated him, their own son. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Hiroshi. I call upon my next witness, Akira Tanaka.
So am I. I find Tripp's parents guilty as charged.
Thank you, Akira. I call upon my next witness, Riverbell.
I said it before, I know Tripp teamed up with Timothy Ortiz to harass Lemon and Lime, and my wife and I were horrified about it, but that was before we found out about Tripp's past. Apart from getting bullied by the Martel brothers and 3 of their friends, Curtis and Winter never gave Tripp any help to cope with his drama. All they did was abuse him. And all the abuse they put Tripp through only made him worse. So for everything they did, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, River. I call upon my next witness, Kendall Bell.
I agree with River. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Kendall. I call upon my next witness, Brittany Bell.
All right, what Tripp and Timothy Ortiz did to my younger sisters was worse than the trouble I could ever cause, but Tripp's parents have been abusing and neglecting him. Even I'll admit, 2 wrongs don't make a right in this case. So I find Mr. and Mrs. Wilson guilty as charged.
Thank you, Brittany. I call upon my next 2 witnesses, Lemon and Lime Bell.
Aside from disowning Tripp for what he and Alexine did to Akio, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson assaulted him a few times themselves. They didn't care about his injuries at all. Yeah. And they did also without a care about the fact that he got bullied for dreaming of becoming a wrestler in spite of them being poor before attending high school. So in conclusion, I speak for myself and Lemon when I find Tripp's parents guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, girls. I call upon my next witness, Charles Myrtle.
Look, Curtis and Winter, I know Tripp threw a glass bottle of sage and gave Vincent a concussion. But he only did those 2 things to get back at them for bullying him prior to high school. And their former principal dragged me and my 2 sons into assaulting him and Alexine for what they did to Akio. Speaking of which, I also heard about you 2 conspiring with Gracie when she threatened to have you 2 abuse all 3 of her kids if their father tried to stop her. This makes you 2 accomplices in her wicked scheme. So for everything I just mentioned, I find you guilty of child abuse, child neglect, child abandonment, and conspiracy.
Objection, Your Honor. What Sage and Vincent did before high school is no excuse for Tripp to act like a racist, homophobic, and violent psychopath.
Yeah. When Tripp was getting bullied, he was too soft to even stand up for himself. But since high school, he's become an irredeemable monster.
I said before that I understood all the stuff Tripp did in the past, but I'm still overruling your objection, because that's no excuse for you to abuse him. And I believe the rest of the Martles feel the same way about Tripp as Officer Martle does. Speaking of which, may I call Lily Martle up to the stand, please?
I agree with Charles. Curtis and Winter, you 2 treated your own son very badly. So I find you 2 guilty of everything you've done to him as well as your hands at Gracie's scheme against her own family.
Thank you, Lily. I call upon my next witness, Sage Martle.
Look, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, I get that Tripp got violent towards me, my brother, and all my friends, even acted racist and homophobic, but you've been abusing him back home. You never gave him a chance to make amends with everyone he did wrong. You even abandoned him after when our former principal made us assault him and Alexine on school grounds.
How's that any different from how your parents treated you? They're disappointed in you and Vincent for bullying our son.
Unlike you 2, my parents gave me and my brother a chance to bury the hatchet with not just Tripp, but Deacon and Caden. So we took it and made things right. I regretted all the times Vincent and I assaulted Tripp up to the point where you 2 gave him the boot. So for the stuff you yourselves did to your own son, I say you're guilty.
Okay, Sage. But I'll let you off with a warning. If you get into any more beef with Tripp by committing any more mass assaults, you're going to jail. You understand?
Yes, Your Honor.
Good. I call upon my next witness, Vincent Martle.
I agree with my brother. I find Tripp's parents guilty of not just everything they did to their own son, but also for their involvement in Alexine's mom's wicked scheme.
Thank you, Vincent. Also, I heard that you threatened to shove a baton up Tripp's butt when you assaulted him. So if you do that, you're going to jail. You understand?
Yes, Your Honor.
Good. Now then, I call upon my next witness, Landon Dale.
My first son Michael may have bullied Tripp prior to high school, but Curtis and Winter made things worse when they neglected and abused their own son. and disowning Tripp the day he and Alexine got expelled and arrested for assaulting Akio was the last straw that broke the camel's back. They didn't even bother to treat his injuries or give him a chance to redeem himself. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Landon. I call upon my next witness, Kendall.
I agree with Landon. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Kendra. I call upon my next witness, Michael Dale.
You know, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, I can definitely sympathize with Tripp when it comes to beatings. When I was a troublemaker, my mom threatened to give me the belt the day I got grounded multiple times, all because I disrespected her when she told me to get off of my computer. But since you two actually did give your own son a bunch of beatings, you stooped to a level my mom never could, and I don't like it. You also neglected him when he got severely injured from the 2 mass assaults I got involved in, as well as the first time my former principal ever assaulted him on school grounds. And, unlike my parents, you never gave Tripp a chance to apologize to everyone he messed with. All you did was treat him like a punching bag and throw him away like he was garbage. So for all this stuff you did, I say you're both guilty.
Thank you, Michael. I call upon my next witness, Indigo Dale.
I agree with Michael. Sure, our mom had me laugh at him as a punishment for framing me for what happened to my bed, but it wasn't as serious as what Mr. and Mrs. Wilson did to Tripp. Therefore, I say Tripp's parents are guilty.
Thank you, Indigo. I call upon my next witness, Mason Dale.
I'm on the same page as my family. I find Mr. and Mrs. Wilson guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Mason. I call upon my next witness, Frederick Halifax.
Curtis and Winter did nothing to help Tripp stand up to any of his childhood bullies, including my son Dustin. They called him soft, abused him, neglected him, and disowned him. They never took him to a therapist, they never treated his injuries, and they never gave him a chance to redeem himself and apologize to everyone he did wrong. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Frederick. I call upon my next witness, Tracy Halifax.
I agree with Frederick. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child neglect and child abandonment.
Thank you, Tracy. I call upon my next witness, Dustin Halifax.
While it's true that I bullied Tripp, I not only feel bad for him because of his family being poor, but also because his own parents abused him for all the trouble he caused. I regretted my hand at everything my friends and I did to him, but his parents had no remorse for neglecting his injuries or assaulting him themselves. And the worst thing that they've done was disowning him the day he and Alexine got expelled and arrested for assaulting Ackah. Therefore, I say Mr. and Mrs. Wilson are guilty.
Thank you, Dustin. I call upon my next witness, Dexter Dash.
I'm on the same page as my nephew and his parents. Dustin may have bullied Tripp, but Curtis and Winter are no better because of the way they treated the latter. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Dexter. I call upon my next witness, Annabelle Dash.
I agree with Dexter. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child neglect and child abandonment.
Thank you, Annabelle. I call upon my next witness, Weston Dash.
I'm also on the same page as my cousin. We were all in the wrong for assaulting Tripp, for giving Vincent a concussion, throwing a glass bottle at Sage, and assaulting Akio, but Mr. and Mrs. Wilson treated him very badly. So for everything they did to their own son, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Weston. I call upon my next witness, Mackenzie Dash.
So am I. I say that Tripp's parents are guilty.
Thank you, Mackenzie. I call upon my next witness, Asher Langston.
Tripp may have started a fight with my son Jackson over a seat during class and provoked him into putting him in a chokehold. But that's almost as bad as the way Curtis and Winter treated him. They abused him, neglected him, assaulted him a few times, and worst of all, they disowned him in prison. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Asher. I call upon my next witness, Rosa Langston.
I agree with Asher. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Rosa. I call upon my next witness, Jackson Langston.
Before my ex broke up with me for what I did to Tripp,
I had no idea that he got bullied by Sage, Vincent, Michael Dale, Dustin Halifax, and Luke Rivera over being poor. But aside from the bullying, Tripp's parents added more to his misery by abusing him, neglecting him, and disowning him, especially for acting racist and homophobic. And ever since Sasha told me about how hard Tripp's life's been, I began to regret all the stuff I did. As for his parents, I find them guilty for everything they did to him.
Thank you, Jackson. But I'll let you off with a warning. The next time you put Tripp in a chokehold, and if it happens to kill him, you're going to jail. You understand?
Yes, I do.
I call upon my next witness, Richard Rivera.
Ever since Luke made amends with Tripp and told me what Curtis and Winter did to the latter, I couldn't believe it with my own eyes. From what Luke told me, Curtis and Winter abused their own son, neglected him, and disowned him. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Richard. I call upon my next witness, Ariana Rivera.
I agree with Richard. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of Creo abuse, Creo neglect, and Creo abandonment.
Thank you, Ariana. I call upon my next witness, Luke Rivera.
Senor and Senorita Wilson, you guys ought to be ashamed of yourselves. Abusing, neglecting, and disowning Tripp. And not giving him a chance to make amends with me and my amigos. You ain't got no idea how badly you screwed up. For all the stuff you did to your own son, I say you're guilty.
Thank you, Luke. I call upon my next witness, CJ Rivera.
I agree with Luke. I find Tripp's parents guilty of their hand at abusing him.
Thank you, CJ. I call upon my next witness, Ethan Cassidy.
Tripp may have gotten my daughter Abigail expelled along with her ex-boyfriend Sage and their friend Stephanie by framing them for vandalizing their old high school. But between all the stuff he did during high school, all the times he got assaulted, and all the times he got bullied prior to high school, his parents never did anything to help him see the error of his ways. All Curtis and Winter did to their own son was abuse him, neglect him, and disown him. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Ethan. I call upon my next witness, Charlotte Cassidy.
I agree with Ethan. The way Curtis and Winter disciplined Tripp only made him depressed and angry. So I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Charlotte. I call upon my next witness, Abigail Cassidy.
Look, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, I know Tripp threw a glass bottle at my ex and got us and Stephanie expelled by framing us for vandalizing our old high school. But there was more to what's been going on between Sage and your own son. Before high school, Sage and Vincent were bullying Tripp all because you were poor. All Tripp wanted was to become a wrestler, but my ex and his brother crushed his dreams. And you two didn't do anything to help him stand up to the Martell brothers. And when Sage and Vincent reconciled with him along with Alexine and Deacon, he told them that you two have been abusing him. Aside from the 3 mass assaults I got involved in and the time Serenity's dad assaulted him for harassing her, you two assaulted your own son and neglected him when he was hurt. So you're no better than my former principal or how my ex used to be prior to high school. Therefore, I find you two guilty for everything you've done to Tripp up to his disowning.
Thank you, Abigail. I call upon my next witness, Patrick Westbrook.
Aside from all the stuff Curtis and Winter did to Tripp, they were also involved in Gracie's scheme against her own ex-husband and their kids.
Objection, Your Honor. Winter and I had nothing to do with Alexine's punishment. What's going on with her family is none of our business.
Really? Because from what I heard, Gracie threatened to not only murder her own ex-husband, but have you two abuse all 3 of their kids, if he ever tried to stop her. If anything, you two are accomplices. So for your involvement in Gracie's threat, I say you're guilty.
Okay, Patrick, thank you for your testimony. I call upon my next witness, Sadie Westbrook.
I agree with Patrick. Curtis and Winter, I find you two guilty of not only everything you did to Tripp, but your involvement in all of Gracie's crimes.
Thank you, Sadie. I call upon my next witness, Ruby Westbrook.
Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, when I heard what Alexine's mom did, I was shocked to find out about that and your involvement in one of her threats against her dad. And I'm pretty sure Tripp's not happy about that. So for everything you did to your own son and for conspiring with Alexand's mom, I say you're both guilty.
Thank you, Ruby. I call upon my next witness, Bennett Carter.
Even though Tripp snuck into the girls' locker room back at Springfield, as well as doing the other stuff he got punished for during high school, Curtis and Winter did not discipline him correctly. They assaulted him back home, neglected him when he got severely injured, and disowned him. If anything, that's child abuse. Therefore, I say they are guilty.
Thank you, Bennett. I call upon my next witness, Ackah Carter.
I agree with Bennett. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Ava. I call upon my next witness, Neville Carter.
Tripp may have gotten Sage, Abigail, and Stephanie in trouble by doing much worse than what I did to my sister Victoria, but Mr. and Mrs. Wilson are no better. Thanks to them, Tripp was never raised properly. His parents abused him by assaulting him, neglecting him, and disowning him. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Neville. I call upon my next witness, Victoria Carter.
Personally, I was shocked when Luke told me what he did with the Martell brothers, Michael Dale, and Dustin Halifax prior to high school, but he had no intention of assaulting Tripp. But when Luke and I apologized to Tripp and Alex for all the mass assaults we got involved in, I was even more shocked to learn that Tripp's own parents abused him back home. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Victoria. I call upon my next witness, Gavin.
Tripp may have punched Stephanie in the face at the park in TechnoGlitch's channel and ungrounded Stephanie in JG the Animator 05's channel, but he didn't deserve to get abused. Curtis and Winter are just as bad as Tiana. So for all the stuff they did to their own son and their involvement in Gracie's crimes against her own family, I say they are guilty.
Thank you, Diesel. I call upon my next witness, Gavin.
Adding on to what my dad just said, Tripp's parents conspiring with Alexand's mom reminds me of my mom co-founding the Punishers with Boris. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Eric. I call upon my next witness, Stephanie Gavin.
Look, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, I know your son beat me up at the park a few years ago. You've been abusing him just as much as my mom did me and my siblings. Like you did to Tripp, she assaulted me and Natalie a bunch of times, but she also grounded me for dumb reasons and gave me a bunch of punishment days. And your conspiracy with Alexine's mom is just as bad as the Punishers, my mom's hit squad of child abusers. Therefore, I say you're guilty.
Thank you, Stephanie. I call upon my next witness, Natalie Gavin.
I agree with Stephanie. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson were accomplices in Alexine's mom's wicked scheme. Just like Boris and the rest of the Punishers were in my mom's run from the law. So I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Natalie. I call upon my next witness, Terrence Gavin.
I agree with my older siblings and our dad. I find Tripp's parents guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Terrence. I call upon my next witness, Elizabeth Gavin.
I'm on the same page as Terrence. From what I heard, our older siblings and our dad feel the same way about Tripp's parents. So I say Mr. and Mrs. Wilson are guilty.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I call upon my next witness, Joseph Gavin.
I also find Tripp's parents guilty. What they did to Tripp didn't count as discipline. That's child abuse.
Thank you, Joseph. I call upon my next witness, Eric Katz.
From what my daughter Sasha told me and her mother, Curtis and Winter abused Tripp for everything he did at Springfield, including the time he started a fight with her ex. Jackson may have put Tripp in a chokehold along the way, but Curtis and Winter assaulted the latter a few times and neglected him whenever he got severely injured. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Mr. Katz. I call upon my next witness, Peyton Katz.
I agree with Eric. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Peyton. I call upon my next witness, Sasha Katz.
Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, while I understand Tripp started a fight with Jackson and drove him to put him in a chokehold, you two went too far when you assaulted and neglected him. Your own son. I mean, Jackson may have put Tripp in a chokehold, but Mr. and Mrs. Langston didn't disown him. They gave him a chance to apologize to Tripp and bury the hatchet. And that's something you never did with Tripp. Therefore, I say you're guilty.
Thank you, Sasha. I call upon my next witness, Trey Katz.
Gotta agree with Sasha on this one. I find Tripp's parents guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Trey. I call upon my next witness, Serenity Jones.
Look, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, I get that Tripp harassed me on my first day of high school back at Springfield. But ever since I found out about Sage and Vincent bullying him, I felt bad for him. And I was also shocked to learn that Alexina and her siblings have been abused by their own mom. And what's worse, you two were involved when she threatened to have you do the same thing if Alexine's dad tried to stop her. That makes you two accomplices. Therefore, I say you're guilty.
Thank you, Serenity. I call upon my next witness, Dakota.
I agree with my daughter, Curtis and Winter. Even though my ex-husband assaulted Tripp twice in the school hallways, you two are no better. You two didn't care for your son at all. You abused him by assaulting him, neglecting him, and disowning him. Because of that, he couldn't stand up to his former bullies without becoming the bully himself. So for all the stuff you did to your own son and for getting involved in Gracie's threat against Andres for trying to stop her from abusing their kids, I say you're both guilty.
Thank you, Dakota. I call upon my next witness, Carson Whitelock.
Curtis and Winter are bad parents. From what Penelope told me and her mother, they didn't teach him to stand up to her ex and his friends without resorting to violence. They neglected him, even when he got brutally assaulted by the Sage crew. They even gave him a bunch of beatings themselves at home and sent him in prison. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Carson. I call upon my next witness, Madison Whitelock.
I agree with Carson. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Madison. I call upon my next witness, Penelope Whitelock.
You know, it's one thing for Sage, Vincent, Michael Dale, my ex-boyfriend Dustin, and Luke to bully Tripp for dreaming of becoming a wrestler in spite of being poor. But for Tripp's own parents to neglect him when he got severely injured from the 3 mass assaults against him back at Springfield and give him a bunch of beatings themselves? And then disown him the day he and Alexine got expelled and arrested for assaulting Akio? That's wrong. So for everything Mr. and Mrs. Wilson did, I say they're guilty as charged.
Thank you, Penelope. I call upon my next witness, Abiku Ackah.
You know, Curtis and Winter, I can understand why you disowned your own son. But what he did to his former fellow student Akio wasn't even serious enough for you to do that. My family and I may not take kindly to racist people, but the way you addressed your own son's racist and homophobic behavior during high school was clearly child abuse. So for assaulting, neglecting, and disowning him, I say you're guilty.
Thank you, Abiku. I call upon my next witness, Ackah.
I agree with Abiku. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Afi. I call upon my next witness, Asante Ackah.
Adding on to what my parents just said about you, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, I know what it's like to deal with racist people. Where I come from, there was a dangerous group of troublemakers known as the International Terrors. Like Tripp, Deacon, and Alexine, they were also racist and homophobic. Only thing is, most of the members of that gang have done much worse than your son ever did.
What? What did these international terrors do that's much worse than the stuff the Tripp gang did?
The leaders of the International Terrors, Oliver Kellen and Amber Griffiths, used knives to assault 2 Japanese-American girls and kidnapped and tortured William Kellen and Aluna. Oliver and Amber also threatened to have a child predator named Clinton Parker hurt William and Amelia, Oliver's own siblings, unless they stayed quiet about the gang's motives. Landon and Clint Becker did the same thing to their brother Sam and their sister Abby, but they also threatened to murder their own entire family, including their mom and stepmom. They even threatened to kill them with daggers they got from Oliver and Amber. As for Lucas Cook, he threatened to have Clinton mess with Charlie too. Lucas' own brother. As for Kelsey and Melanie Wilson, they had Clinton hurt Callum and Summer for refusing to join the International Terrors. Their own younger siblings. And finally, Kylie and Ashley Bates kidnapped Charlie and tortured him all, because not only did he quit the international terrors, he broke up with the latter twin sister. So what Tripp did back at Springfield wasn't as serious enough as were all the crimes that Oliver, Amber, Landon, Clint, Lucas, Melanie, Kelsey, Kylie, and Ashley committed. As for you, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, for disowning Tripp for something that was never too serious to begin with, I say you're guilty.
My word. That's insane. These international terrors must have been real psychopaths.
Yeah, but on the bright side, the people I just mentioned got arrested and disowned by their parents. And the stuff they did was serious enough for their parents to do so.
Okay, Asante. Thanks for your testimony, I guess. I call upon my next witness, Alan Brooksdale.
As a father who has a son who dreams of becoming a wrestler, I know better than to abuse any of my two sons. No matter which one of them causes trouble, all I do is ground them. Sure, Tripp acted racist and homophobic, which is something Era Slim and Tavon would never do. But Curtis and Winter only disciplined him by assaulting, neglecting, and disowning him. Their own son. They crossed a line that I will never cross. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Alan. I call upon my next two witnesses, Era Slim and Tavon Brooksdale.
Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, my brother and I are very disappointed in you two. When I bailed Tripp out of prison back at Springfield, I hoped that you'd welcome him back with open arms.
What? You bailed our son out?
Of course I did. And Tavon and I know what it's like to have a rough childhood while at the same time dreaming of becoming a wrestler.
I agree with Era Slim. 3 years ago, our mom passed away all because she committed DUI. She collided with another drunk driver the day. The loss of our mom broke us. And that was the main reason why my brother formed the Hawkeyes in the first place at Starcadia Bay. We've been grieving over our mom's death since middle school.
Yeah, I mean Tripp did tell me that he got expelled and arrested for assaulting Akio and brutally assaulted by the Marisol Martel brothers and their friends. But you two ain't no better because aside from disowning your own son, you neglected him and abused him. And you were also involved in Alexine's mom's threat against her dad. So even though we're still eps of the Martels, for everything you've done to Tripp, I speak for myself, my brother Tavon, and the Hardcore Legion when I say you're both guilty.
Well, your mother's death must have been quite devastating. But I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that last part about these Hawkeyes, or this Hardcore Legion you mentioned. What happens at Starcadia Bay stays at Starcadia Bay. I call upon my next witness, Punisher Black. Oh my goodness. What in blazes are you?
This is just my demon form.
Oh, the horror. Look at those eyes. They're so creepy.
Punisher Black, can you, change back to normal? You're, scaring everyone in the courthouse.
Actually, I can. But more to the point, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, what you did to your own son was totally uncalled for. Tripp was bullied by the Martel brothers and you didn't even do anything to help him. You only abused him, neglected him, and disowned him. So for that, I say you're guilty.
Thank you, Punisher Black, I guess. I call upon my next witness, Leonard Neffs.
My son Carnage may be a demon, but the trouble he caused was never serious enough for me and his mother to disown him. And he's been laying low lately. And Curtis and Winter, the same thing could be said about the way you two treated Tripp. Despite everything he did at Springfield, you abused him, neglected him, and disowned him. And for that, I say you're guilty.
Thank you, Leonard. I call upon my next witness, Patrician F's.
I agree with Leonard. I find Curtis and Winter guilty of child abuse, child neglect, and child abandonment.
Thank you, Patricia. I call upon my next witness, Carnage Neffs.
Oh my goodness. That guy's even scarier than Punisher Black.
How is there even two demons in this courthouse?
Never mind that, Your Honor. Anyways, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, Tripp may have gotten bullied by the Marisol Martel brothers, which resulted in him acting racist and homophobic. However, the way you discipline your own son didn't right the wrongs done to the people he himself messed with back at Springfield. Though your reasoning is justifiable, your actions made Tripp hate you too, and the Sage crew even more. So for everything you've done to your own son, I find you both guilty.
Okay, Carnage. I thank you for your testimony. Before I have a heart attack, I would like to call Andres Davis up to the stand.
Andres? You're testifying against us? After when you and Gracie disowned Alexine for assaulting Akio back at Springfield? Why?
I had no intention of disowning my own daughter Curtis and Winter. Gracie forced me to do that and give Alexine the belt for bullying Justin and Phoenix. She even threatened to murder me a bunch of times, mostly with a gun, and to have you to abuse all three of our kids. My ex has also been abusing Cody and Julian behind my back. You two have been conspiring with my ex ever since Alexine started dating your son, who you assaulted, neglected, and disowned in spite of him getting bullied by Sage and Vincent.
Andres, Gracie couldn't stand your daughter dating our son. And you know it.
Yeah. Alexine's been a bad influence to Tripp. They both assaulted Akio out of racism, and she teamed up with Simona to bully and make fun of two autistic people.
I'm not defending Alexine and Tripp's actions, but none of them were serious enough for us to disown them. You conspired with Gracie on purpose. And for that, I say you are guilty. And I better not see you two anywhere near any of my kids. Otherwise, I'll file a restraining order against you both.
Okay, Andres. If Curtis and Winter do try to do anything to your children, you can file a restraining order against them. I call upon the next main victim of the crime, Alexine Davis.
Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, it's one thing to beat your own son up back home, neglect him whenever he gets severely injured, and disown him the day he and I got expelled and arrested. But to conspire with my mom when she threatened to have you two abuse me and my younger siblings if my dad ever tried to stop her again. You two have really crossed the line here. For all the stuff you did to Tripp and for your sick alliance with my former mom, I say you both guilty. And one more thing. Stay away from me and my family, you sick monsters.
You stay away from our son. You've been a bad influence to him.
Not so fast. You sick monsters will not lay one single finger on Alexine. You heard her father. Do that and he'll file a restraining order. Anyways, I call upon the next main victim of the crime, Cody Davis.
I agree with Alexine. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, not only have you two been terrible parents to Tripp, but you've also been in cahoots with our mum. So I say you're guilty.
Thank you, Cody. I call upon the next main victim of the crime, Julian Davis.
I agree with Cody and Alexine. I find Mr. and Mrs. Wilson guilty of child abuse, child neglect, child abandonment, and conspiring with another child abuser.
Thank you, Julian. I call upon my next two witnesses, Crowtoon Productions Incorporated and Crow Girl 22.
Curtis and Winter have never supported Tripp or even helped him improve on his behavior. They gave him a bunch of beatings, especially for acting racist and homophobic, neglected him every time he got severely injured, and downright disowned him when he was in prison.
And the worst thing is, they forgot that he was bullied by Sage, Vincent, Michael Dale, Dustin Halifax, and Luke for dreaming of becoming a wrestler even though they were poor.
So for all the stuff they did, I speak for myself and Crowgirl 22 when I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Crowtoon Productions Incorporated and Crow Girl 22. I call upon my last witness, Sam Wiggle.
Aside from all the stuff Curtis and Winter did to Tripp and their involvement in Gracie's threat against Andres, they grounded me all because I gave them a bad card in my 1,000 subscriber behavior card day special. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Thank you, Sam. And finally, I call upon the last main victim of the crime, Tripp David Wilson.
Tripp, don't you dare testify against us, young man.
Sorry, Mom and Dad, but you two leave me no choice. Your Honor, my parents didn't care how badly I was treated at school. Whether it was because of my former bullies or my principal. They gave me a bunch of beatings back home, neglected me every time I got assaulted by my former principal in the Sage crew, and disowned me when I got expelled and arrested. And worst of all, they conspired with Alexine's mom, who threatened to have them abused, not just Alexine herself, but Cody and Julian as well. And the worst thing is, they never gave me a chance to redeem myself and apologize to everyone I messed with back at Springfield. Not only have I been completely traumatized by all the times I've been assaulted, but I've also been having suicidal thoughts from everything I've been through my entire life. I'll never forgive my parents for everything they've done to me. They've been treating me like a punching bag for years. Therefore, I say they're guilty.
Oh, poor Tripp. Poor you. Okay, I think I've heard just about enough. Curtis and Winter Wilson, according to all witnesses' stories, I hereby find you two guilty.
Uh-oh.
Therefore, I hereby sentence you to 280 years each in prison. And since you already disowned Tripp, he'll no longer be in your care. Instead, he'll be living independently since he's currently 19 years old. Officers Larson and Hawk, take them away.
Alright, Curtis and Winter, this is your cell. You'll be staying here for 80 years each. Don't even think about escaping.
Yeah. You scumbags better stay in your cell. Because if you even try to escape, your sentence will be extended. We got our eyes on you too.
Okay, rookie. They get the point.
Whoa. This city really doesn't take kindly to criminals. And yet we're getting treated like one. Tripp, and Ress, Crotoon Productions Incorporated, and Sam Wiggle, you're all gonna pay for this.
Quiet.
That new cop sure is mean.
Oh, big time.